So, ich hoffe, es sind alle wieder im Saal.
I hope everyone is back in the conference room, short lunch break, but nevertheless, I hope you all could strengthen and had intensive discussions in the break. We had always enough times for breaks during the conference for an exchange, and I think you used that quite well. And now we are looking forward, after all the intensive discussions of the past few days, with a lot of technical details, that now we have a discussion round where we take a higher altitude, so to speak, and take a more general all-round look. That is climate protection versus noise protection. I think that was something that we heard several times already. And speakers told us that there are measures that help both, and that was also in the past the case. But we heard that in future maybe it not necessarily will be the case, and that we have to keep an eye on it. And then also, what can we do from a legal point of view? How can we regulate it? What can we determine? And this is what we are going to discuss right now. We have a round here, and the discussion participants asked me whether there is a seating arrangement. No, you just select and I present you just how you sit here. It doesn't have any significance, no meaning. Dr. Pierre Dominique Prümm is member of the board of Forum Airport and Region and executive board member at Aviation and Infrastructure at Fraport AG. Thank you very much for joining us. Next to him, Paul-Gerhard Weiß, the new chairman of the Aircraft Noise Commission Frankfurt. Welcome. Next to him, Mrs. Dr. Katrin Dziekan, head of Department Transport Noise and Regional Development at the Federal Environmental Agency. Maybe there we get another view on these subjects. Next, our Minister of Economic Affairs, Tarek Al-Wazir, Ministry for Economic Affairs, Energy and Transport and Housing. Nice that you are here. And next to him, Dr. Markus Fischer. We know him already. You gave a presentation before the break and were also answering questions during the question round. Senior Vice President Aeronautics at DLR. And next to you, Matthias from Randow, Chief Executive Officer with the German Air Transport Association. Welcome very much to all of you. I'm really happy to have this colorful round with representatives from different organizations and institutions, and I'm looking forward to hear all your different views and opinions. First question, we heard about the correlation between noise protection and climate protection, some measures that reduce CO2 emissions also reduce noise at the same time. We heard the open rotor that might be noisy, so that was not helpful when it comes to noise reduction, noise abatement, so there is conflict potential here. The question, how do you weigh this subject in the future? What will be more important, less important in the future? How can you get that together? And how can you make sure that noise protection is considered also in the future? Here we would like to get your opinions. Mr. Al-Wazir, you nodded most strongly, so let me ask you to start. Yes, thank you very much. Let me put it that way. Looking back, there have always been different points that were highly interesting, especially here in the region, if we look back to the past steps of expansion of the airport and the discussions we had. Where was it? What was it about? With the runway west, there were a lot of protests because of the forest and the system, and others, it was rather about noise and air quality. All around the northwest runway, the forest didn't play a big role any longer, and that was why during the construction measures, protests were quite reduced. And protests rather started when it was too late. That was after the opening. Then they saw that noise was mainly a big problem. And if we now have a look at the debate, it's climate that really plays the most important role, and the impact all around noise among the protesting group is not really top of the agenda. if I can put it that way. Maybe it's a question of age also, if I may say so. As a result, that's how I see it. And I want to make sure that climate is protected. I mean, that's the question of the very survival of humankind, just to put it in such a bold way, but that's the way it is. And then we have sometimes win-win situations, also when it comes to noise abatement. The last big wave of fuel prices being increased, so everyone said try to save, be efficient, and if you look at the A320neo, that's the win-win situation, that's the result. But for landing, there is no difference, zero difference, because then you would have to touch the design and change it, and it's strange. The 747-8 makes 1 decibel more noise when landing. And then we can see the one or other is not always the same. And from my point of view, as someone who has dealt with that question for a longer time, I think at the end of the day, we need to get to climate neutrality. For that, we need different designs, definitely so. And at the same time, we have the situation that noise also has an impact on the environment, and we still have to consider this aspect as well and incorporate that in our considerations, avoiding that we go in direction that you can't live any longer close to the airport, or all around the airport rather. And another point, from my personal opinion, there are target conflicts, but in the near region around the airport, noise needs to be a priority of our considerations. It might be that you have to fly detours, 3, 4, 5 kilometers. Think of our southern detour. In terms of climate, it would be rather logical to go straight via Raunheim and Rüsselsheim, but that would not be tolerated because of the high noise. And it's all about the total balance of climate. Departure and approach doesn't play such an important role. So in this region, noise would be my priority, even if at the end of the day more energy was to be consumed. So that goes in direction departure and approach processes. Mr. Weiß, as head of the Noise Abatement Commission, would you see it similarly, or what has been your experience between this field of tension between noise abatement and climate protection? I think Tarek Al-Wazir quite rightly described it. That's precisely the position also of the Noise Abatement Commission in Germany. We say close to an airport, noise protection has to get the priority. Otherwise, it's not a good idea to, weigh noise abatement against climate protection. That would lead to failure if that was the development, because airports, as a rule, are close to conurbation areas. Conurbations really have grown a lot. More inhabitants, more and more people affected. And Dr. Schmid showed us the scenario. If for the noise reduction technologies we don't have success, then till 2015 we'll have a doubling of the noise protected areas and noise exposure, and that cannot be, and there will be a revolt. So that would be wrong. We wouldn't be well advised to do so. We really have to take this integrated approach and develop research accordingly. And there have been a lot of examples in that respect. At least I heard them, that looked into the two aspects in the same way. Thank you very much. These were two perspectives also with respect to the regional situation around the airport. The Federal Environmental Agency has a different view here that is maybe a bit broader. How would you see it? I'm sorry, microphone is not on. Oh, yeah, here you are. I can only support what Mr. Al-Wazir said. Climate protection is top priority, but sound protection, health protection in that way is also important, just as important. And we presented in 2019 already a concept where we want to have environmental friendly air traffic that has low noise. And here we had 8 components that we propose. Noise definitely is one aspect, but it's also about an integrated airport planning, and the national level should do that, where airports should be located in Germany in order to have the lowest possible number of affected inhabitants. Infrastructural planning in a sustainable way. Then also short distance flights should no longer be necessary. People should go by rail. Climate neutral emissions, catchword fuels. How do we deal with that? We heard about electrical driving, and that brought me back down on earth with respect to noise. So that's an important discussion. Noise reduction by having noise protected areas and night curfews really implemented. We don't see that that happens immediately, but at least you have to move in a certain direction. And there is a high ambitious value laid down by the WHO. In real terms, we can't fulfill that, but at least we need to go in this direction. And also the Federal Environmental Agency has made proposals in this direction. Let me add one other point, which is at the end, but is really important. Don't fly that much. Most silent flying is the flight that doesn't take place. I know that I'm here at a conference with a lot of people interested in flying, busy in the aircraft industry, etc. Therefore, it's difficult. But remember what we managed during Corona. We had video conferences, replaced flights. There was interest of the near environment for holidays, maybe not flying far away. So these are discussions that we have to carry out, also against the background of climate protection, but definitely also in favor of noise abatement. If we can reduce, we can also reduce noise. Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. von Randow, the Chief Executive Officer of the German Air Transport Association. Less flying, night curfews. You looked a bit skeptical. What's your opinion on that subject? I didn't look skeptically, but I attentively listened. Let me give you 2 figures of the thread of climate change, threads that are real. In Germany, 80 million people are affected. Noise exposure because of air traffic in the night with 50 decibel, according to the contours of the Federal Environmental Office, about 20,000 people are affected. You could conclude, quite logically, climate protection has top priority. In one way, I would underline that. I think it's the biggest challenge of sustainability in air traffic that we bring flying in line with climate protection. But nevertheless, we shouldn't play it off against each other. One example to illustrate this. Take, for example, the question approach procedures to airports. Here we know that there are approach procedures that really are helpful when it comes to noise abatement. And we know also at the same time that such an approach process leads to certain detouring with more fuel consumption. In such a case, you can conclude easily, of course, it's helpful for noise abatement, and that's why we do it. I mean, really stay easy-minded, and thousands of kilometers are flown, and there we have to really decarbonize. So it's not against each other, but it's different. It requires different fields of action, and we should not play it off against each other. And I think in the past 1.5 days, we really have seen at this conference, if we take a look at the technology, that's highly interesting. The technological innovations, engines, aircraft designs, they both achieve noise reduction and protect the environment, mostly. That was just the entry into the discussion. Now my question immediately. You are optimistical that there are saving potentials, CO2 reduction can be achieved, and what technology would you favor? What do you think where the future will go? Do you dare? Mr. von Randow? I thought the question was rather both, but once again the question whether in technology development, whether you can make a differentiation. I need to understand your question. Differentiation according to climate orientation, respectively, noise reduction. Now, I'd rather ask you about climate protection. What kind of technology could help us to achieve climate goals best? What technologies? Many. I mean, that's well known. But let's take the two big instruments quite clearly. In a nutshell, by far the biggest instrument till today is the fact that old planes are replaced by more energy efficient planes. That's the biggest lever to massively reduce energy consumption and fuel consumption, reduce CO2 at the same time. Then the replacement of fossil fuels by more sustainable fuels. That will take a bit. The more so we have to make a start right now into this decarbonization with the help of sustainable fuels. Mrs. Dziekan, you wanted to say something on that. Yeah. Mr. von Randow, thank you very much for this. But at that point, I would like to add that the problem with the more efficient planes is super. That's really good, but unfortunately, we have too many additional planes. The same with pass cars. Definitely, they become more efficient, but the total of greenhouse gas emissions stay very high because we have many more of those. And another point I would like to add here, the sustainable fuels are good, but you have to not only consider the CO2 footprint, and the DLR has made calculations, and there are flight-sensitive processes where the non-CO2 effects are relatively small. So maybe by a factor of 2 or 3, you really have to add that when it comes to the non-CO2 effects, other emissions. But you know that the non-CO2 effects strongly will be reduced once we make the transformation towards more sustainable fuels. This will show enormous effect, especially the condensation lines, etc. Dr. Fischer, as a scientist, definitely can add a few points. Yeah, that's what I just wanted to do. Ms. Dziekan, you mentioned the DLR directly, so maybe Mr. Fischer, you can come in on this part from other effects. You have to switch on the microphone and put it close to your mouth. Yeah, now it works. At the end of the day, let me answer it in the following way. If we generate noise, it eats up the energy of the aircraft that we would need in order to drive it, to fly it. So that's inherent anyways in our genes. We would like to make the aircraft as efficient as possible, consume as less energy as possible, and therefore automatically we would research into efficiency, whether it's CO2 or non-CO2 factor or noise. It all goes in the same direction. So for us, there were two big levers, and Mr. von Randow mentioned some of them already. One is the intrinsic energy consumption of an aircraft is to be continuously reduced. And I think we really achieve a lot till the second half of the century. We do that with the help of a lot of new technologies, new engines, saving fuel cells, etc., fuselage, etc., and then better lightweight design, novel materials, etc. So it goes in this direction. Less consumption, fuel consumption becomes smaller. And the second big lever is that what we have to consume still should be as environmentally tolerable as possible. And here we research into sustainable fuels, bio-based fuels, but we would like to go in direction of synthetic fuels. We take care of the use of hydrogen in whatever form, hybrid electrical drives. So that can be concentrated on these two strands. And one thing is clear, air traffic definitely will grow when we look at the forecasts available. All goes in the same direction. And therefore, we need to do more than what we would do as if air traffic with the present number would stay as it is. So beyond that growth, we have to do even more. And therefore, from our side, a big challenge, and we need to make sure that the money we spend, all of us together, should be spent at the source. That is to research further technologies that make us more efficient. Maybe you can be a bit more precise, the non-CO2 effects. Mrs. Dziekan mentioned that if you reach CO2 savings, at the same time you also save other climate effects that are generated by aircraft. So for a long time we talked about CO2 effects because that was from ground-based traffic and transport. That was a metric system that we all knew. But in air traffic it's a bit different because we fly at altitudes where the emissions of the engines have even a different effect. And here the non-CO2 effects come into play, like different gases, NOx or methane or water or soot particles that have an effect that are classified under non-CO2 effects, including the consequences because of cloud formation that has a negative effect on the back radiation on the Earth. So from a scientific point of view, there are still some uncertainties, but you can roughly say that the total impact of air traffic, 1/3 is CO2, 2/3 non-CO2. Not very exactly, but the 2/3, well, we need to look at that. That really would make sense. And we as scientists see that probably we can be much faster and more effective to work on the non-CO2 effects. On the CO2 effects we work anyways, but probably we can't reach that much with them as we have thought, because the ramp up of alternative energies, etc., takes time. With the non-CO2 effects, we can do a lot. And here the catchword is intelligent trajectories, like do we have to do it as we do it today, or the regions that are highly climate sensitive globally, and we can really forecast that precisely. Can we fly around it? And latest studies have shown that the effort for this is really worth it a lot, because the additional operating costs will be compensated for by more than a factor of 10 by reducing the non-CO2 effects. A big, big lever. Thank you very much. Mr. Al-Wazir, may I ask an additional question, as you just said that the non-CO2 effects, because here the catchword was what components you mentioned suit. Let me do it concrete. Less sulfur in kerosene is less ultra-fine dust particles on the ground, and less soot, carbon black, non-CO2 effects very high up in the sky. Is that so, or did I simplify too much? I mean, the big levers are, of course, NOx, nitrogen, and then soot, black carbon. And we do that together with fuel manufacturers. We say, let's have a look at the fuels, and the formulations should be changed in the way of aromatics and the different combustion processes. And here the engine manufacturers come into play. They can harmonize this very precisely, making sure that NOx and black carbon emission are much smaller, much smaller. And it was reported in the press recently, Airbus, Rolls-Royce, Neste and other partners, together with us, carried out experiments with one of the most modern aircraft, the 350 that we have, and the 319. And the two engines were given 100% sustainable fuel, bio-based fuel, and as a result, the nitrogen and the black carbon emission could be reduced by 50%, which was really a big, big effect. And you can play with the formulations. Thank you. I would like to add a point here. The question of the minister really brings us to the core of the non-CO2 effects. The big subject is the formation of the condensation lines. And Dr. Fischer pointed out that the problem is the radiation in the night. It wouldn't work. The cooling effect doesn't occur. During the day, we have the condensation lines, but not in the night. So the interesting question is, when would they form? They form because of certain particles that are emitted. If there is certain air humidity, water molecules bind, and then you have these stripes, the condensation stripes. And let me answer two questions. It's no problem if I fly in areas where I can avoid this high air humidity. That was the question about the trajectory. And then if I use a fuel where I have less particle in which humidity would accumulate, would settle. And that's what I meant. The sustainable fuels, precisely for this reason, have also this positive non-CO2 effect, because we see a trend that there is less humidity settling on the particles. And therefore, trajectory, the routes, and sustainable fuels is really the pivot issue. You talked about ultrafine particles as well, which definitely is relevant for the region, and we had a discussion about that as well. So we see that there are different viewpoints to consider. And we haven't heard Mr. Prümm on that subject. As airport operator, Fraport, you are located in a region that is heavily affected, so you experience it and also run an airport. What's your perspective? Just coming back to noise, moving away from the highly interesting climate protection subjects that we could discuss over days. Right. The essential aspects have been mentioned in the discussion already. Climate neutral flying, and how do we avoid exposure here in the region? These are two important subjects for the industry, and we have to do both. You can't separate the two. There are correlations and interrelations. I don't want to repeat everything. Close to the airport, quite clearly, the immediate exposure needs to be reduced, and that's due to flight noise and not CO2. And then there is another aspect that has not been mentioned before. We are working on a climate-neutral airport. The airlines try their best. They want to become better in terms of climate protection. We make our contributions, they make their contributions. But CO2 is a global matter. If we work on noise here in Frankfurt, then every measure that we implement here, that we design here, that we plan here, that we implement, has an immediate effect on the region. And this is another important point. It shows that we have to do both. And it had a negative touch when we talked about climate neutrality or less CO2. I'm really optimistic. All technologies to make flying more climate neutral are already available. We have it. It's possible. And in the next years and decades, definitely we'll make a lot of progress. We need a lot of support, because from the industry, from the market economy as such, we won't be speedy enough. And therefore we need a very good regulatory framework, but we can make it if we can work together. And I'm highly optimistic that we can do so, because at the end of the day, flying is a big human dream, crossing big distances in a short period of time at high speed. That's what everyone wants. And globally, we see that more and more people want to fly. We want to network. We want to discover the world. We want to experience new things. And that's why we have to come to terms with these two big subjects. Thank you very much. In the past 2 days, we have heard that the research really comes from different directions. And we heard about sound protection, noise abatement, that there is less subsidy, less grants, that research doesn't get that support as before. But we heard that noise abatement was part of the coalition agreement of the present national government in Germany. And this is how I want to start the next block of questions in your direction. In the presentation of Dr. Schmidt, we have heard that the best noise protection is the development of more silent aircrafts and binding regulations that stipulate that these aircrafts have to be used. This goes in that direction, what to rule. Unfortunately, we have no one here from the European Union Commission that can help us out here. And therefore, I would like to ask you the question, or ask you to imagine you are EU Commissioner for Traffic and Transport, and you could determine a certain measure or rule and could determine what is to be considered. What would be your measure? What would you say is the best lever, making sure that noise abatement gets the significance it deserves?
Kommissar.
I would love to be a EU commissioner because I have so many ideas. First of all, there are two topics: noise and climate neutrally flying. The question is how to make sure that politics create a regulatory framework giving guidance to the airline companies and the aircraft industry to move on. And forbidding something, bans, have never been a good idea. Of course, there are some restrictive political measures, but they've never been the best choice. It's always a better idea to give incentives. When it comes to climate neutral flying, if I was a commissioner, I would launch a program for the entire aviation industry in Europe and to make it climate neutral in the next 15 years. And this is not only a huge opportunity for the industry, it's a huge opportunity for the entire continent, as all our fuels are not coming from Europe, only a few of them. The rest comes from other countries. I mean, one reason is that we don't have that much crude oil on the European continent. And it does not matter where the climate neutral fuel comes from. The only thing you need is climate-friendly resources. So why don't we launch a project, an initiative, which changes the conventional fuels step by step by alternative fuels? And then the target should be to become climate neutral in 15 years. But unfortunately, we don't see anything like that coming from the EU. They pass directives and regulations, and nobody cares where the fuel comes from, the fuel we need. And others are role models with the Safe Reduction Act. The Americans are doing it much better, and this is the much more promising way. And the same goes for noise. So incentives would be key. We're talking about the scrapping bonus for passenger cars. How comes that we don't have a scrapping bonus for planes? And the biggest effect in active noise abatement comes from planes. So why isn't there a motivation for a rapider fleet turnover, for more rapidly exchanging the fleet? So less prohibitions, less bans. I think at the end of the day, you can pass a ban, introduce something which is forbidden, but this should be the last choice, the last means. So I'm applying for the post of a commissioner, but to be honest, I will probably never make it. But maybe there's somebody else who's more ambitious. Okay, so the scrapping bonus for planes. Mrs. Dziekan talked about bans on night plans, I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. There are many more nicer descriptions. But I also thought what to do if I was an EU commissioner. I have a whole list. I think I would make sure that at ICAO level we will have more stricter regulations on noise abatement. But we can see so many delays as we have this study, that research project. I would like to make sure that things move on faster and that we get stricter rules which are applicable to everybody. Everybody has to comply with them. And if there is non-compliance, it will lead to some competitive disadvantages. And Mr. Randow mentioned something which is also important. I would like to see a faster implementation of bans, which means that you're not allowed to fly over densely populated areas. And then noise contingents should be mentioned, which means you should no longer be allowed to fly, for example, in certain areas if the noise level is big anyway. So this is something which should be considered. Maybe more flights, but the flights need to be quieter over less densely populated areas. And then, for example, some emission fees for approach and departure. This is something I would like to introduce if I was an EU commissioner. So the market should rule and take over. If we have, for example, quiet planes, if we have CO2 low emission planes, they should be incentivized, and if others are producing more noise and CO2, they should pay fines. And mixing quota, I would like to have a PTA quota in order to make it faster. Power to liquid, I would like to have this, a synthetic fuel which comes from renewable energies. So this is something which was also mentioned by Mr. van Randow, biofuels, which are also supported by the federal government of Germany. And I would like to make sure that all the great things which were mentioned today and yesterday, all these innovations are introduced in the markets much faster. We need something like funds making sure that start of production comes much faster. So this is my wish list, and maybe we can take a vote later on what to do first. Thank you so much for your input. Now let me ask you, is there anything else you would like to add to Dr. Dziekan's comments, or are there any contradictions, objections, whatever? Any other ideas? Mr. Al-Wazir, let me put it like that. When it comes to climate protection, the European Union is on the right track. Our CO2 targets are so ambitious, and now it's being discussed at the federal level in Germany whether we are the ones slowing down the whole process. And the same goes for e-fuels, for example. Are we still doing the right thing? So therefore, there's not much to add from my side. But when it comes to noise, this kind of ambition can nowhere be seen. In the past, it was different because we perceived the noise differently. Now I'm 52 years old. I was born in Offenbach, and I know that when I was swimming at the Rosenhöhe, we could see huge Boeings flying over the swimming pool. And at the beginning of the 90s, the Gulf War, the air base still existed in Frankfurt, and we could see the Galaxy flying over Frankfurt without any ban on night flights. This was really horrible. And these were years where the European Union already was very ambitious. They said Chapter 2, Chapter 3 should be abolished. And nothing against incentives, Mr. von Prümm. We've been working very well for quite a while, and we also wondered what to do in order to speed up the fleet rollover. So there are so many things which are good and right. However, we are reaching a point where we still have some planes in the mix where we're wondering, is it still necessary to have them? And If you think of Eltville or Rüdesheim on the railway, and if you listen very carefully what kind of cargo train has the old braking system, which is no longer allowed, and they were given 5 years to retrofit the brakes of cargo trains, but we still know that they are being operated. So whenever I'm at home, I can hear some hissing noises, and then I look outside, I can see, for example, the old trains or the Finnair having no vortex generator. How comes? Why are we not more daring? I was also in Toulouse, talked to the Airbus board and said, now you get the vortex technology, but I have heard that individual planes are not using the vortex generator. So how comes? How comes that we're not using this simple technology as a rule? So nothing against incentives, I'm also in favor, but maybe the remaining 5% need to be equipped with the latest technology, otherwise they're not allowed to land in Frankfurt. Mr. Prümm, would you like to comment on that directly? But this is exactly what I said. The ban is always the last choice, the last option. We have technologies in the markets which are very successful, but getting the last 5 to 10% implementation rate getting done might be done with a ban, with a fine. But what about the first 80–85%? How can we make sure that 80–85% of the planes will get the latest technology? The same goes for noise. I mean, we are still right at the beginning when it comes to noise abatement, and I think we have to regulate the market differently. I totally agree to what you said. The level of ambition in Europe is good. I personally would like to see even more ambitious people, as we have the technology available already. And the direction we've chosen in our approach, for example, having that mixing ratio which is being increased step by step, is not my personal choice. Others might wonder, doesn't matter, allow them whatever ratio or mix they want to have. We have other options for climate neutral fuels, and let's invest our money, the know-how, the subsidies, the innovation in that area. So besides all these environmental topics, it's also an economic issue. And this needs to be clear. In the next decades, everywhere in the world, decisions will be taken on where these kind of alternative fuels will be produced. And I'm worried that we in Europe are going to miss a huge opportunity when it comes to energy autonomy. We need to make sure that we have energy production in Europe or together with partners somewhere in the world where green electricity can be produced. And the decisions are being made now. And I would like to seize this window of opportunity right now. This is why I think we should be more ambitious. Matthias von Randow will probably agree when I say the industry is mature, we can see the necessity, and this is why we should do more. I mean, we've been using the E10 fuel for quite a while, and the mixing ratio in aviation might be reached only in 10 years' time. We have to react much faster. But ramping up faster is not being done on paper by saying you have to. You can only reach it by making sure that we have enough volume of renewable energies, green energy sources, alternative fuels, and this is why I expect from the European Union more ambitious, powerful steps. So you talked about climate neutral fuels, but I would like to go back to noise. Let me ask you, Matthias von Randow, coming from the German Air Transport Association, what would you do if you were the EU Commissioner for Traffic? What is then your idea? Well, I would like to stick to the environmental topic, but okay, let's talk about noise. And of course, climate challenges are huge, and this is why I would love to carry on discussing climate control and reducing CO2 emissions. But okay, good. You would like to have a comment on noise. It's okay, it's fine with me. But let me tell you that we are focusing mainly on environmental protection in the German Air Transport Association, and we're very pushy. We have many more ideas than the German government has at the moment. But okay, now I'm the EU Commissioner for Transport, and I have to produce some ideas in noise abatement. First of all, I'd say I do not want to give a fixed technological solution to reduce noise. If I tried something like that as a politician, I might probably fail. There are others who can do it much better than me. They can develop innovative new things, new technologies, much better than me. But I would like to give a framework, which means I would like to protect people from noise, as I do believe that this is an urgent necessity. We have to protect their health, and this is why people need to be protected from noise. This kind of protection requires a framework, and I have determined this framework in my position as the EU Commissioner for Transport. And this framework says that the member states of the European Union have to pass clear, precise laws on noise. They have to define threshold levels, caps, in order to protect their citizens from noise. And this is what we have. We have it already. At the same time, it's like this. My EU Commission, my Directorate General Environment, said in 2021, we have to reassess the situation. What's the present status? And this is why the European Union conducted a survey amongst the member states and talked to the Noise Commission, mandated a study on noise, and this kind of study was published some months ago. It was in June last year, and it's very interesting to read it. We've learned from that study that we already have a good noise abatement policy in the EU already, and this is what the study conducted by the Directorate General of the EU Commission has seen. So this was my answer. Okay, thank you very much. So you'd say we already have the necessary laws, we have the right directives. It works. The policies determined by the EU Commission show their effects. It's the Directorate General Environment conducted that survey, and the survey showed us that we're on the right track. Mr. Weiß, what do you say? Well, the people affected by noise might have a different opinion here. They are not really thrilled by the results of your policies. Especially if you go back to what Mr. Schmidt showed us in his presentation. We learned that we have more air traffic, which means more noise, and this worries us. This is why we need different instruments, making sure that the technological progress is properly implemented, that's implemented at all. Otherwise, we will have more noise. So we have to find a different approach. So either, and I don't like that very much, we will determine a framework. This is a health risk. This is too much noise. If you're not complying with the noise standards, you have to pay a fine. Or, and I like that very much, we give economic incentives, but I don't know whether scrapping bonus is the right choice. I mean, this is also quite expensive. And these scrapping bonuses are being paid indirectly by the taxpayers. And if the taxpayers are paying for that an aeroplane is being scrapped, then it's also the taxpayer who should have a say on the prices for CO2 emissions and noise emissions at the same time. So if you're producing noise and CO2, you have to pay for it. And so far, the airlines only had to pay airline charges and fees, but only in homeopathic doses. So the dosage was very, very low, and the effect was low as well. And I understand that the rules, regulations, and also the fines should be the same for everybody. Otherwise, the entire airline industry will have difficulties in coping with all these different regulations and fines. So if we ask from them to renew the fleet very quickly, then everybody knows that this cannot be done overnight and that easily, which means if we pass a law, it has to be complied with by everybody, and it needs to be feasible. People have to pay for it. And of course, we should not forget that lots of people would like to travel the world. It's also their right to learn about foreign countries, to travel there, but you cannot get that for free. Everybody should be aware of that. Thank you so much. We had different proposals. We also heard some objections. And now it's 5 to 2, and I learned that we have to close the discussion very soon in 5 minutes' time. So we talked about science before. Now we are rather in politics. But Dr. Fischer, I would like to hear you once again from the scientific point of view. If you were an EU commissioner, what would you do? As this is a noise abatement conference, I would like to speak on behalf of the acoustics people. We've been talking a lot about climate effects, CO2, non-CO2, and we're working on new regulations. When it comes to noise research, however, then we know that there were very strict regulations and implementation rules which worked very successfully. The ICAO chapters need to be mentioned here. Or, for example, the new quota accounts from the airports. Lots of progress was already made in this respect. And if you ask me what to do if I was an EU commissioner, then I'd say I wouldn't pass more laws, no more regulations. We have enough of them. The only question I would like to ask is, how comes that we're not putting into practice what we already know? Maybe the financial incentive is missing. And this is why I'd say, let's create incentives, making sure that those who are doing something good and who are doing something good to people living in close proximity of the airport are being protected. So these companies, whether it's airlines, whether it's the airport, whoever, I would like to reward them. They should get incentives. And I would like to go back to what the minister said. Something which was maybe not that obvious for everybody amongst the population. You talked about the 707, the Galaxy, and so on. The latest plane generation, the A350 or A380, the high-rise systems were built because of performance reasons, but the front edge system and the back edge system were designed because of noise abatement. And we know it from the Boeing colleagues when it comes to the 787. Noise protection was one important element in constructing the plane. And this is being forgotten, so people are already doing quite a lot. Well, this brought us again to the technical aspects of noise abatement we discussed in the past 2 days. And you said that noise abatement was one important aspect in the airline design. And climate, of course, is important too, because everybody's discussing it around the globe, and everybody also wants to make sure that whatever we do, emissions and noise are being reduced. So thank you so much for giving us insight in your work, for participating so lively in the discussions. And now it's almost 2 o'clock.